Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Victoria, and I'm joined here by Lincoln. Our first session is going to be on profile and privacy. So that's your profile, building it in LinkedIn, and then the privacy settings, everything that you need to know in order to share what you want to share and not share what you don't want to share. I'm not going to spend too long talking to you so we can get straight stuck in. But what I would like to say is if you're not already registered with the Officers Association, please do so. You can access our jobs board, our roundup newsletters, which tell you everything that's going on, events, jobs that are interesting and more. And you can also book in for a consultation with one of our career consultants who can give you expert advice, CV reviews, and a one-on-one LinkedIn review specific to you. But yeah, that's all from me. And now I will hand over to Lincoln. Thank you, Lincoln.
Cool. Thanks very much. Morning, all. I know it was mentioned briefly anyway, but in terms of today, in terms of this morning's session, the way we've got it set up means that you're able to use the Q&A function as a means to be able to pose any questions or thoughts or ideas that you have as they come up throughout. We don't have, unfortunately, an audio option. We had used it previously. Not everybody knew how to unmute themselves or mute themselves, so we kind of just made it more sense to make sure we use the chat and the Q&A alternatively in terms of the session today, just to make life much easier. As Victoria said, so my name's Lincoln Coutts. I suppose a quick bit about me. I've spent the last 20 years working in the HR consulting industry, primarily around careers. My early career, for my sins, I was a recruiter. Realized recruitment though wasn't for me. So actually went to an outplacement company as a client. While sat there waiting for my meeting, I printed some stuff off. The printer broke, so I fixed the printer. They then asked me what was I doing for the rest of the week. I spent the next 6.5 years working for them. That company was known at the time as Right Associates, then became known as Right Management. And that was when I first started to get to know the OA, because Right Management obviously have the CTP contract. Was when I first started working with them. But I left them and grew my career beyond. So I've kind of worked for pretty much every organization in the career space, both as a consultant, either as an employee or as an associate. But the specialism I've had firmly for the last 17 years is around all things technology, particularly careers based around social media. So it's something that I know exceptionally well, right from the top in terms of upper echelons of business, right the way down to kind of shop floor. And I do a fair amount of teaching as well on the subject also as we go. But the reason I'm able to kind of talk about this as much as I can is that my background beyond the career stuff is that for the last 17.5 years, I've been really specializing in particularly LinkedIn and its use. I came to become a member of LinkedIn very early on, even before it really kind of taken off. There were only 100,000 people using it globally when I first joined the platform. But seeing the power and the strength that it had, it kind of intrigued me. And I started to work with it more considerably. And then when they opened their London office, I started to work with them as well. I've never been an employee of theirs, but for 12 years, I was one of their partners, which basically meant we kind of had to go in and sweep up the problems they created with their clients. But it also meant I really had to truly understand the platform from every aspect. So not just about job search, but also the work that I would do with corporates in terms of how they'd hire or look to onboard or recruit staff, but also from LinkedIn's perspective as well. So it does kind of help me sit for a fairly unique position in terms of understanding the whole version of it, in terms of where and what it does and what it's capable of doing, as much as anything else as well. In terms of the format today, though, I mean, I hate slides, so we've got a few though, just to make sure that everybody gets up to speed. But what I really want to focus down on is really helping you understand what's important, particularly when it comes to having a decent profile. I mean, it kind of goes without saying anyway, but given the fact that the importance of it is such that this is the reason as to why we dedicate a good proportion of the session to it. What I also do want to talk about, though, is the frailties, but also the opportunities that do come from it, particularly around settings and privacy, and actually its usage off that as a result. And depending as to whether you're currently serving or not, there'll be certain things that you'll also maybe want to factor in and be aware of, particularly different aspects in terms of how the site operates. You know, there's been some recent press, which hasn't necessarily been always the best in terms of how it's being used and or how it's being manipulated or altered. So it's something you just want to really be aware of as much as anything else. But what I do want to then do is kind of spend the rest of the session then running through kind of how we can start to really get to grips and starting to use it to a point. Obviously, I do appreciate that a good proportion of you are also attending this afternoon session, but what I'm keen to do is for anybody who's not attending this afternoon to be able to walk away feeling comfortable and not just, well, how do I have things set and what do I say, but also how do I start some of that engagement and some of that usage as well. And then, as I say, thereafter, it's kind of anything else that we can fit into the session as well. I mean, it's 2 hours, which in theory is a reasonably length of time, but invariably it's always the case, which is the time runs quick and we do tend to run out. So what I'm really keen to do, as I say, is do please put in any specifics that you might have by way of questions or similar. It would be great if you want to, now you know the agenda, to look to incorporate those as we go as well. I can see on the chat a couple of comments come in. Yep, Jeffrey, yes, the recording will be made available. We're currently recording it obviously as we've all agreed to, and what typically will happen is a couple of days, maybe next week, early time, once the video has been altered, then it will be available for review as well. So notes are always a good thing, because clearly we often kind of know what we're looking to retain or by way of information, but it does mean you can get a copy of the recording as well. That said, doesn't mean you should all then just disappear off and do something else. It's good to please kindly be here in terms of engaged as well. So I'm just going to shut up for 1 second and just see if anybody has any specifics in terms of what they want to then get from today beyond this morning's profile in terms of a clear plan and what we should be looking to do, and likewise privacy and settings and then an element of usage. So like I say, feel free to either use the Q&A or alternatively use the chat function if there's any specifics then you want to have covered this morning as we go. That's either everybody can't find where the Q&A section is, or alternatively there's nothing else to be said. Fab. All right, in that case, let's get going. So I suppose an easy place to start, and certainly quite topical at the moment, is probably with dear old Jeff Bezos. Obviously in the headlines at the moment, perhaps not for what they intended, but that all said, I really like this statement that Jeff is credited with from a couple of years back. Your brand is what people say about you when you leave the room. And that's one of the things that's really important to certainly bear in mind, particularly when it comes to our online presences, because ultimately at the end of the day, whenever anybody views or sources or discovers information about us, we're not sat there to influence it beyond what they're able to read or learn. And the big thing about LinkedIn in particular is that actually as the platform has developed over the years, it has become an incredibly trusted site in terms of information and what the platform does. Now, the reason I say that is because actually what the platform was designed to really do initially was about how do you build and maintain your network. That was the principle behind it that was first kind of created and the question that they wanted to answer. But as the site has grown up over the years, and bear in mind it's been around for 18 years now, it has very much formed this niche as being that professional site, rather than necessarily the where you chat about your dog or your cat or your avocado toast or otherwise. Not to say that doesn't happen, but it is very much about you professionally based on how you want to be seen. And the trust that's become from the information is outstanding, in the sense that I do a huge amount of work, particularly with headhunters. And there is a real kind of, what do you say on LinkedIn versus what do you say on the CV? There's an expectation that there'll be a lot of accuracy with the information. And because the information is, as I say, is never being read with us sat there, what we're really keen to look to make sure that we do is we want to make sure that what we create within the profile really enables somebody to understand and learn about you without you being there to say it. So it's not a CV. The principle behind it, and certainly the purpose in which we want to intend it for being, is we want to think about the information as being much more of a rounded you in terms of complete information rather than just a CV. Because if we think about a CV, a CV more often than not is quite a dull document. It's fairly dry often. It often includes information that we wouldn't necessarily want fully public. So we want to think about how we actually scale some of that and alter some of that information as we go. So like I say, we're going to kind of run through different aspects of it as we go today. But the thing to bear in mind, as I say, and really worthwhile, particularly regarding your profile, is that the person reading it is not sat next to us. So what's the impression we want to create? I see I've got a Q&A question come in at the moment. Thanks very much for that. I will definitely cover that as we go through this morning. Okay, but I mean, where can LinkedIn help? Well, why do we really use it? I mean, for me, first and foremost, as I say, it is about your professional brand. It's not just the ability to create it, but more importantly, you get to control it. Yeah, when I first moved to London back in 2000, post studies, I know I don't look that old, but when I first moved to London, if you Alta my name, because Google didn't really exist, you got a whole bunch of stuff about a retired driving instructor from Bournemouth, who's my grandfather, or a health professional in Scotland, who's my dad. There was very little about me. So even though my name was relatively unique, there was often a lot of assumptions based on the information discovered on the web. But the beautiful thing, or one of the advantages certainly with LinkedIn coming along, was that suddenly I had the opportunity to be able to position me based on how I wanted to be seen, which really did enable me to start to kind of change things. Beyond it, though, as I say, the whole purpose of the site is about networking. The original intention that Reed and others had when they launched the platform was about how do you build and maintain your network as you move through your career? Because all too often, particularly back then, for those of you old enough to remember, if you would go and do a job, you would work closely with those individuals for a set period of time. But unless you were really good at networking or you really thought about it, you typically lost those relationships as you transitioned on to the next. So the idea behind LinkedIn was it enabled you to collect and maintain those networks as you moved. But as all things happen, whatever the initial idea might be, things change. And particularly in the case of LinkedIn, how it started to then develop was much more as an informational tool, not just about individuals, but actually as a means to be able to source and learn about subjects or areas as well. The big turning point, I think, for LinkedIn certainly was back in 2008 after the global crash, because suddenly that was a point where the site really grew up in terms of not just its own membership and usage, but also more importantly, in terms of how people started to interact with the site and how they viewed it, and actually how companies and employers started to use it. Because there's a lot made of the fact that LinkedIn is heavily used for recruitment, and it is, and it's because of the ease for which employers are now able to get in touch with people. And that's certainly how it's really started to scale, and unsurprisingly, it's a significant proportion of their revenue. Though I do remember back in 2005, first meeting the founders, particularly Reed, and saying to them, do you know it gets used for recruitment? He's like, well, we kind of get that, but we're not sure if it's a big deal. Ironically, it's about 70% of their income today in terms of recruitment-based activity. So it is significant without a doubt. And then the final point for me, certainly here, is talking about the whole concept of staying up to date, not just with trends and information, but also with your network as well. All too often over the years, I've met with people who have invested a significant amount of time and effort getting themselves up to speed, particularly on the side, particularly with their profile on the network. But then what they do is they have success, and then they're often in their eyes of success is they land the next job, and then they kind of forget about it. And that's one of the things I'd certainly suggest, though, is that we don't forget about it. It needs to be something that moves with you. It needs to be something you also maintain. So we'll touch upon a few different aspects of how we might do that and in more detail this afternoon, but I'll cover a few parts of that as we go this morning. But for me, as I say, where it can really help, it's about your brand. It's about relationships. It's about gathering content and insights. It's about opportunities that may come off the back of it. And then finally, as I say, it's about staying up to date in terms of the information. Now, why does this all matter? Well, partially because of the size. I mean, today as it stands, LinkedIn's now got over 760 million members, which is a big number. If you take that into Europe, though, the membership then is just over 210 million. In the UK, there's now 30 million people using it. For those of you up to date with your stats on the UK, that 30 million figure is huge if you think about that against the working population. And if arguably you put that against the professional working population, you're looking at somewhere in the region of about 85% of professionals in the UK are on LinkedIn. Now, being on something and using it properly are two different things, but it does show and certainly hopefully highlight the importance of it as a platform. So depending as to whatever your intentions may be, you may well find if you're looking to control professionally what's out there about you, it's kind of a bit of a par for the course and an expectation you're going to be there. Corporate information is included and it's starting to grow significantly. So there's now 58 million company profiles within the platform, and there's been a few changes to them in recent months. And one of the things I want to talk you through a little bit today as well is actually how you can ascertain and source information through these. Groups within the platform are exceptionally powerful, though often underutilized, and I'd say probably a bit of a poor relation when it comes to most people using the site. So if we have the time and opportunity this morning, I want to touch upon a couple of areas, but certainly we'll go into more detail for those of you around this afternoon. Hashtags are powerful. It's one of the ways in which you can source information and sort information within the platform, though I must admit at times it does feel a bit like Instagram. And for those of you familiar with Instagram, you'll know what I mean, which is when people post, they kind of incorporate a ridiculous amount of hashtags to try and help the information being sourced, which isn't necessarily how we want to be using it. Events within the platform is a relatively new area, though ironically it started just before lockdown, so it was launched in February of last year. And actually the timing of it couldn't be any better. They really did luck out. But the advantage of the events particularly are there are thousands of events hosted through the platform weekly. And actually, again, if you're looking to network or gather information or even promote your own organization, actually these events can be something that would be worthwhile looking to tap into as well. And then finally, there's an influencers program, which at the moment has got 17,500 members. Now, the influencers are deemed to be people influential, according to LinkedIn. And they're individuals, it's almost like as a way to kind of verify they are genuinely them. But the individuals themselves tend to be people who know subjects well. And as part of being an influencer, they agree to be able to share their insight. So there's a lot that can come from that. And again, equally, depending as to what your intentions are, it can be quite a nice way, particularly to learn from individuals that kind of know the subjects they're talking about as much as anything else. But beyond the knowledge and insights, things that are worth knowing. Now, firstly, your network is an important aspect in terms of understanding. And where I talk about your network, I mean within the site. Something we'll touch upon in a second is actually the fact that we have content visible externally, but initially within the site, what's worth knowing is the fact of how your network operates. Now, your network within LinkedIn is defined very simply. It's all based on degrees of separation. And for those of you who've ever played the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, you'll know what I mean, but it's all to do with the fact that people know people. So starting out, initially you start with you. And what then happens is you send a series of invitations, or somebody sends one to you. And once they're accepted, those people become direct relationships or first connections. You agree to be in each other's networks as a result. Ideally, they're people you know. Beyond that, though, the people they then know become secondary relationships. And ideally, it's your contact's contact, friend, family member, whoever they may be, but it starts to then give you this exposure of individuals. You then also have a third relationship. And then finally, if you choose to, by joining groups, the group members also form part of your network as well. Now, the reason this is important to point out, or the reason I want to spend time on this, is the multiplying effect that occurs through the platform is substantial in terms of who gets to see you. But also the other thing to bear in mind as well comes back to something I mentioned earlier around content, which is you've got to be mindful as to what you say, because in truth, you don't know who a second relationship is. Probably also even less likely to know who a third relationship is. But given they're part of your network, it means they have access to you as well as you having access to them. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the multiplying effect through these levels of relationship means that you suddenly become quite visible very quickly. So for argument's sake, let's say you joined the site and let's say over time you have only connected to 250 people, which still might sound like quite a high number, though in LinkedIn terms, it's relatively modest. If each of those 250 people know 250 people, that means at second relationship, you've got a further 62,000 individuals visible. If they also know 250 people, that means you're seen by over 15.5 million people. So even if you only know 250, and on average, that's what runs through your network, you're talking visibility and being seen by over 15 million people, which is a phenomenal number. If we to take it to the rule that LinkedIn use, which is all to do with 500 plus, and I'll explain some of that as we go. So if you know 500 connections and each of your connections know 500 people, that means at second relationship, you're looking at 250,000 people knowing you. That means at third relationship, over 125 million people know you. So it really does mean that when we start to think about the content, as I say, we really want to be considered and mindful. But it also means as an advantage, we can actually discover quite a lot of people that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to know through the relationships we can form through the site. What people get access to from your network by way of information in a basic term starts with a profile. So you'll have some form of imagery, ideally a photograph, potentially a background. You'll have some form of statement around yourself, particularly your employment. You'll have potentially some form of introducer, who you are, what you do, so on and so forth. Your experience then becomes visible, equally so does your skills if you choose to allow it. But further information can also incorporate things such as education, recommendations, as we see groups, companies, and influencers, but also areas such as activity. So people get to see what you're doing, what you're interacting with, what you're up to, and similar. So whatever we choose to create within a profile, and as I say, it genuinely can be anything we wish it to be, but what it enables you to then do that you're still talking a sizable network in terms of visibility, and clearly we're talking about a sizable amount of content available if you were to just simply choose to take a CV rather in terms of data. So please don't just focus on a CV, I suppose is the point I'm trying to make. See the comment coming from Anish. Yep, quite true. The multiplication assumes there's no overlap, whereas often there is going to be a high overlap between second and third. Completely agree. But I suppose the point I'm really trying to make here is that, even if you do only know 250 people and that sits as an average, okay, there's 15 million. But arguably, if you take out the dupes, you're still talking millions of people within your network. So it's still highly pertinent to be aware of actually who sees what by way of information, particularly when it comes to your profile. So do just please bear that in mind. Equally, that said as well, is obviously I'm taking it as a crude number of a 250 average. Obviously, there's anomalies and there's an exception. So to give you an example, I have over 4,500 connections. So if any of you were to choose to connect to me, immediately that number would grow significantly, far greater than the 250 or the 500 I was talking about. So this is where we obviously need to consider and just really be mindful as much as anything else. But Manish, understand your point. Okay, so I'm just going to shut up for a second and just make sure that this, in terms of what I'm saying at the moment, kind of makes sense. So we've all got a reasonable idea of why we might be using it. We've got an idea of actually who gets to see what we can actually exploit it for, and obviously content within a profile. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second and see if anybody's got any questions. If you don't have any questions, then we're going to jump into the site and start using it live. Okay, I'll take nothing, well, either slow typers or I'll take there's nothing needed. Okay, so this is me just switching across. Now, hopefully you can all now see, Manish, I'll definitely talk about content in a second, but I don't. Okay, so this is my, hopefully you can all see Google on the screen now. Just want to check, can everybody see that? Would somebody mind saying yes in the chat? No, okay. No. Fabulous. In that case, let's try now. Fabulous. Thank you. The joys of technology. Right. Okay. So first things first. Why have I got Google up? Obviously, Google is influenced based on us as a member or us as a user, but I just want to use this as a kind of a starting point because, as I mentioned already, one of the concepts in terms of everything that goes through the site is the fact that information is accessible, but it's not just about what's available within the platform, but it's also about what is available externally to the site. Because one of the things that LinkedIn decided to do from day one was enable some of your information to be accessible externally to the website, not solely on the platform. Now, what does that manifest itself as, or how does that look? Well, put simply, if you Google a name of an individual, the chances are at some point somewhere it will come back within the first 10 results, and it tends to be a LinkedIn link that comes back unless the person you're searching for shares a name with a sporting or personality, celebrity, etc. So if I were to start with me, basically, or basic rather, yes, I know the results are slightly influenced, but we can start to see information. So the first 10 results come back as this. So go down the bottom, got some stuff around, got the content on the Gazette, I got SobSEO. In fact, this is today's event being promoted. This is some old videos for the OA and also British, the BCS as well, British Computing Society. We've got some content coming through from a couple of different websites and some of the businesses that I work with. But the first two links coming back are results coming from LinkedIn, which is not by accident. Because as I mentioned, one of the things that LinkedIn do is make information exceptionally available externally to the website. So if I were to just simply click on the top result, what this will then do is it'll take us not only into the platform, but it takes this into my profile within the platform. And the reason it does this is all to do with what's termed your URL. So if I go to my contact info, we can see I have my profile URL here. And in my case, I've chosen to customize this. So it's actually my name, but this is the web link that then is discoverable and available up the top here. It's also what search engines see. So we all by default have one, which means if somebody were to be searching for us by name or similar, you will come back fairly quickly and accessibly if you enable the information to be made available outside of LinkedIn. By default, we all do. So what does this all really mean? Well, this is me within LinkedIn, and this is my account. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will note that I am a subscriber, though everything we're going to run through this morning is using the free version of the platform. Now, when it comes to using LinkedIn, actually the device that you use it on is also quite important. Now, tablet and mobile versions of LinkedIn are okay. And to be fair, the mobile's got some nice features to it, which are not available on the website. However, for doing anything important, particularly around our profile, we always want to be using the website version of the platform. And one reason as to why the website version is most important, put simply, it's LinkedIn's been around since 2003. It was never intended to be an app, only because apps didn't exist. So it was always designed to be a web in terms of the experience. So there's some really nice elements within it, and this is what we're going to focus on today. The other thing that's also worth bearing in mind is actually the browser you use is also important. Ironically, even though LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft, they got bought a couple of years ago, up until this year, Edge and LinkedIn didn't always work that well. On occasion, there's still nuances in terms of how the site sits. So actually the browser you use is something that's also worth just bearing in mind. And the reason I'm just stressing that at this point is I don't have a preference in terms of what somebody may well use. It's just when you come to perhaps redo some of the changes or actually alter the site or do some of the things we're going to be doing in terms of actions, it might not necessarily look quite the same way. Again, as I say, depending on the browser you're using. That holds true as to whether it's Firefox, Safari, Chrome as I'm about to use, or equally as Edge. I mean, they're all pretty much of a muchness, but occasionally there's a couple of quirks. So just worth kind of noting and pointing out. And the other reason, though, finally, I suppose, in terms of why I always advise using the web browser version rather than the app version, is it stops fat finger syndrome. What do I mean by that? It stops you accidentally doing something you didn't mean to, like sending an invite you didn't intend, or accepting an invite you didn't mean to, or liking a piece of content or similar that you didn't mean to engage with. So it just gives you that kind of better peace of mind to see what's in front of you and hopefully perform those actions. Now, as we go through this morning, there's going to be various points where I'm going to go, and here's your homework. Clearly, your homework is going to be everything, but there's a few things that I definitely want to be pointing out in particular. And what I want to start with before we go into the profiles actually is to start with privacy first. And the reason I want to start with privacy first is that all too often people join platforms, and I'm not just talking about LinkedIn, but others as well, and they kind of never really read the T's and C's, nor do they actually appreciate or understand actually what goes on. So one of the things that I really highly recommend you all do as a kind of a action point one is to start with, I'd highly recommend you log into the settings area, which I've just done via me. And then you start literally at the top under account preferences and work your way through each of the individual sections. And you'll see that each area, so there are 6 main areas on the left, and each area has multiple subsets to it. Just walk your way through, making sure you're comfortable with what this all means. And the main reason being is that we very rarely ever dedicate the time to properly look at this stuff, but it's really worthwhile doing. Now, in the main, it's pretty self-explanatory. However, there's a couple of things that are worth just double checking to make sure they are as they need to be. So within account preferences, for example, one of the options here is around showing profile photos. Choose to show or hide profile photos of other members. I'm a big believer in show your profile photo, just because from a memory recall perspective, as much as anything else, it does enable people to remember you. So yeah, it's a good idea to perhaps have a visibility around your photo and perhaps choose to make it available to all members, but that's a personal view. The other piece that's worth bearing in mind, and this will depend as to where you are in terms of your own circumstance, this tab here referring to people also viewed. Now, just to show you what this actually means, and if I just open a secondary tab, so I'm just going to jump back to my profile. Whenever we view anybody on LinkedIn, on the right-hand side, there is people also viewed. And this is then a list of individuals who, when you're looked at by somebody, they also often looked at these other individuals. So in my case, people look at me and they look at Sarah and Jonathan and Elizabeth and Sue and Liz. Now, actually, if I look at these 5 listed rather, I know Sarah and know very well. Jonathan and I've got a business together. In the case of Elizabeth, I don't know who she is, nor do I have any connection to her. Sue is a headhunter I've known for donkey's years, and Liz is an ex-colleague. So I know why these people are here, and I can kind of second guess as to why these people would be listed here as well. However, if for any reason I didn't want people to see who people look at when they look at me. And I'm thinking about that if I was looking at a new job, for example, what I might choose to do instead is turn this off, because it then lessens the likelihood of somebody viewing me and then going, well, actually, they look more interesting than Lincoln, so I'm going to look at them instead. So you might want to just think about this from the perspective of the person viewing the information. Sign-in and security, massively important. Please, please, please make sure you've got correct email addresses. Now, you're able to have multiple if you choose to, but whichever one is set as primary is the one you'll receive communications via. So please make sure it's one you're willing for people to also know, because by default, when you connect to somebody, they gain access to your email address. Further down, you've got the ability to add phone numbers. You don't have to make it visible, but it then just does mean that people can actually get in touch with you, but also more importantly, it means you, from a security perspective, you can reset your password via text message, which is not a bad thing. And then you've also got options around, obviously, sign in. Always a good idea to just keep an eye on this and make sure you've got only one active session. I was talking with somebody a couple of weeks back who had an active session in New York, even though they live in London, and it transpired their account had been hacked. So do just keep an eye on this. And then finally, two-step verification. I would strongly advise you turn this on. It just means that if somebody were able to second guess your password and gain access to your account, it means they still can't gain access without a code of some description being sent as well. So please do consider setting this up. Why am I stressing this point to start with? Well, LinkedIn's not bad when it comes to security. And what I mean by that is actually over the years, they've only ever had one proper data breach. Having said that, they have had multiple scraping breaches where data has been taken from elsewhere. So it's a good idea to just make sure that you shore things up and be a little bit more secure in terms of what you're doing. The other reason as to why it's a good idea to be aware of this as well also is that as of 2 years ago, you were able to send HTML links via chat, which makes sense in the main, but it does then mean that if somebody wants to do something unscrupulous, such as send you a dodgy link or otherwise to gain access to your account, you want to make sure you just secure things down. I've had quite a few clients over the last 6 months who've had their accounts hacked and then content sent to the network, for example, without their permission. So it's a really good idea to just check what's going on. So please do think about securing the account down. That all said, for any of you who are still active service, one of the things you might not want to do is download the app, because I know that there are some security concerns from the forces about the app security, but again, just something worth kind of taking note of. So just spend some time looking at this. Visibility then. Within visibility, this is the piece that we want to certainly spend a reasonable amount of time through. I know you're going to look at it all properly, but this is something you want to pay special attention to because it's all to do with what do people see when you do things. So profile viewing, for example. So I personally am always happy in showing people when I view them. Why do I want to do that? Well, because I've got no qualms in people knowing I've looked at them. Equally, though, in the same breath, it can also act as an introducer in the sense of if people know I've looked at them, I have then seen people who subsequently looked at me, and I've then used it as an opportunity of saying, well, I looked at you, you looked at me, should we have a chat? So do think about how it can be used. Likewise, the data that can be gleaned from this can be quite useful as well. What I mean by that is actually, let's say, for example, you're going for an interview and you have your profile viewing options to show full profile. That means then in turn you get to see when people have looked. Therefore you might see when an employer that you choose to talk to has perhaps viewed your profile. So it's a good idea to certainly consider that. Story viewing options, that relates to mobile only. Stories are a piece of content that can be shared kind of similar to Instagram short posts. So something just worth bearing in mind. Option 3, however, under here is probably the area that you definitely want to take a look at most in terms of visibility, and this is all to do with what the world sees via your public profile. So this is what they gather when you are Googled. So what we're able to set here is a couple of things, and the first thing I'd highly recommend you do is to set your LinkedIn profile URL. By default, we all have a number letter sequence at the end of our name. Often hyphenated now as well as the site's growing up, and it's an auto-generated number letter sequence. What you may wish to do is control this by removing the number letter sequence, and ideally, if you can, have your name. Clearly not always possible, but if you are able to, the advantage in doing so is twofold. The first advantage in personalizing this is once you've done so, you need never change it again, which just makes life easier for the future. Secondly, it then gives you a nice, easy, readable format that you can then use for other purposes, such as website, You might want to use it for linking to things like your from your CV to your LinkedIn profile, or you might want to use it for things like email signature. So really quite a nice touch, and I'd certainly recommend it. The other piece, however, and this is the more important piece, is we need to consider what we want the world to know in terms of information. So firstly, we start with, do we actually want our profile to be visible or not? And I've met a number of members of current and former forces over the years who've chosen not to have a public profile. So they don't want to be accessible via a search that somebody may perform. It's still in the site and they still have the benefit of being a member, but it just means they can't be searched externally. Alternatively, though, if you are happy in doing so and being discovered, what we then need to do is think about what do we want people to then know. And there we have then a sequence of show or hide boxes. Now, by default, because nobody reads the T's and C's, the actual default is everything is always visible unless we say otherwise. So what we want to be then just thinking about, as I say, is just to think through and say, well, what do I want people to know? And simply go through and say yes, no, in terms of turn on or hide the information. So there's a lot going through it, but something that's also worth bearing in mind is if you include things like email addresses and you allow it to then be discoverable here, it means they can be seen via the web. So it does then increase the likelihood of you getting spam, for example. So things that are worth bearing in mind, but do make sure you set your settings based on publicly what's accessible. And to put it in context, your profile within LinkedIn, the maximum number of viewers are the total membership of the site, which is 760 million, give or take. However, your public profile is visible to anybody who has access to the web, which is about 4.5 billion people. So yeah, just think about how accessible you want it to all be and just make the changes accordingly. Going back within the platform, however, then further down, things like who can download or see your email address. Again, make some decisions around what you want to have available within that. Likewise, who can see your connections. And again, depending on the role that you're performing, you might want to close your network off or equally keep it open. Personally, I'm a fan of showing each other that they know them, but again, it's entirely up to you. Who can discover you elsewhere? Likewise, who can source information and gather information elsewhere? So visibility off LinkedIn, for example, includes things like Outlook. So if any of you use the latest version of Outlook, you can have a plugin that then gives you the opportunity to see people's LinkedIn profiles immediately. Again, do you want people to know that or not? You're entirely in control. So please work your way through each of these sections, making a decision. Pay special attention, however, to visibility around activity. Because with active status, this is a green dot that follows you around the site. And there's a decision to be made here, which is, do you want people to know when you're live on the site? Now, in principle, I've got no problems with people showing people when they're available or when they're on the site, but there are two circumstances where you might want to rethink this, depending on your situation. First circumstance is, if you're supposed to be doing something else, you might not want to show people when you're on the site. And what I mean by that is if I go into back to my account, if I then go into messages, and if I now, for example, take Ranjit's, we can see that 9:04, we had a message exchange. I can see there is a white circle around his photograph, which means if I click on the image, I can see that he was available an hour ago on the mobile. Now, if we hadn't had an exchange recently, so let's take Jorgen, for example, his profile is turned off, so it means I can't see when he's active, so I can't see what's going on. If I take it down to Lexi again, I can see that 3 minutes ago, she was available on the site as well. Now, why does that matter? Well, this behavior through the green dot can drive what I describe as WhatsApp behavior. Basically, if you're rubbish at responding to people you're connected to, please don't show them when you're live, otherwise they might get a bit ticked off that you haven't responded to them. So do bear that in mind. So you might want to change it to no one. So if you're supposed to be doing something else and you don't want them to know, just bear that in mind. Or if you're poor at responding, you might want to change this. So just take that into account. Sharing updates around your profile. I mean, clearly, if you're going to go away and start updating your profile, I highly recommend this gets turned off. But the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. So just walk your way through as you go. When it comes to comms, again, some decisions to be made. Do I want to receive messages? If so, what type? And if you ever feel like you're being bombarded with communications from LinkedIn, so I'm not talking about messages from members or similar, I'm talking about from the platform itself, you can actually change how you receive and what you receive. I must admit I've restricted this quite a lot just to make my life a little bit easier, but also because of the frequency on the site. So it doesn't need to send me messages if I'm on the site every day as I am at the moment. Who can reach you though? You can make some decisions around whether people can send you invites or not. But the one piece I definitely again consider is read receipts. You might not necessarily want people to know you've read the message and not responded. So again, you might want to think about turning this off. So again, consider what you do. Second to last, data privacy. Like all things, it's a good idea to know what is and isn't being shared about you. And there's quite a few things that you'll just want to be clear on when it comes to the different aspects of the platform. But one tip, and certainly this relates to any of you who've been using the site for a while, is please get a copy of your data. Courtesy of GDPR, or UK GDPR as it's now known, you're able to request data based on what LinkedIn have stored since you've been a member. Now, for any of you who've been using the site for a while, I personally would recommend you just download everything. If you're fairly new to the site, then obviously there's going to be less information to extract, in which case you may not need to do so. But if you've been using the platform for a while, I'd recommend you download everything, or as a minimum, download connections and imported contacts. These two files are .csv files in terms of how they're delivered, so like Excel spreadsheets. And what you'll then end up with is you'll end up with a list of who you're connected to, what they say they do, where they say they work, email address if they allow you to see it and download it, and also when you connected. Now, the reason the connections file is probably the most useful of the two is because these are the people you're currently connected to on the platform. It's going to do two things. Firstly, it's going to help you understand who you're connected to, but secondly, it will act as a memory jog. And for those of you hanging around for the session this afternoon, we're going to talk about networking, and this is going to be one of the ways in which we start to build that data in terms of networking. Similarly, imported contacts is when you've then given LinkedIn permission to be able to view your profile, view your contacts rather, which you may well have assumed you didn't do, but chances are you will have done at some point unintentionally, in which case actually extracting that information is no bad idea either. Rest under here, again, self-explanatory, but just be comfortable with what you do. And then in particular, be comfortable with what you do in respect of your advertising data. So again, it's the whole what happens with, what gets collected, what gets sent elsewhere or similar. So there's a lot going on in terms of what's taking place. Question come in just whilst I'm chatting. Can I stop everyone from being informed when I update some of my details on my profile? I just want to update qualifications, etc., not inundate. Absolutely. Yep, Don. All you need to do that is under visibility, and it's then this option here, which is sharing your updates. So if you want to update things like qualifications, etc., just simply turn this off. It will then prevent your network from being updated in those changes that have taken shape. The network updates that you tend to be job changes, education changes, or anniversaries. Are the primary things that tend to get shared. So if you don't want any of those three being shared at any point in time, you need to turn this off. So just that's where you need to go. Dead simple. Like I say, I mean, starting out, particularly when it comes to the platform, you want to make sure that you're comfortable. You want to make sure you're considered. You want to make sure you know what settings and privacy mean. And as I say, we've often joined this platform a number of years ago, and it's gone through significant changes. So it's worth just making sure you're up to date with what goes on and how it operates. So just take that time to kick off with. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second and just double check. Has anybody got any other further questions around settings and privacy, or does that all make sense? Cool. In that case, either people are typing or we're all good. Either or. Let's keep going. Okay. So once we've got settings and privacy sorted out, what we need to do is obviously start to utilize the platform in terms of really get the most from it as much as anything else. So first and foremost, what I want to do is I want to start with how we want to think about LinkedIn. And what I mean by that is our profile. So what we want to do is we want to start to think about how that comes together and what that says. And the reason we want to be thinking about those two things is because, well, firstly, it's what everything builds from. So your profile is what LinkedIn knows about you, which is then how they will suggest or make content amendments or introductions or suggested information. So it's built from what you say. Similarly, how people discover you is through what they see in the profile or what's stated or meant within the profile. So the profile is where everything builds from in terms of the usage of the site. Now, when it comes to your profile, there are two things that are worth noting before we go into the detail. So if I go into my profile to start with, as I view my profile, you'll see in order, I have got some visuals. I've got then what's termed a headline. I talk about employment, education. And then further down, I've got this thing here called talks about. Now, this is a sequence of hashtags. These hashtags are hashtags I've chosen, and it all relates to what I tend to say within the site. And the reason I'm saying this is because when it comes to a profile on LinkedIn, you have two options. You have a normal profile, or you have what's termed a creator profile. Now, a creator profile is where you will mark out or make more visible things like what you talk about and also the number of followers you have. So it makes your profile look slightly different. It also changes the order of information. So it means featured content sits further up in the profile, and then the activity sits below, and then the about section sits further down. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because as an alternative, why don't we go to Jonathan? So if we bring up Jonathan's profile, Jonathan hasn't turned on creator mode. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's no hashtag reference. The follower piece is slightly different. If I go a bit further down in terms of order, there's then highlights, then there's the about section, but that then sits above the featured content, which then sits above activity. So it changes the order in terms of what sits where. Now, the only reason I'm highlighting this at the moment is because I have turned on the creator mode, and the reason being is I'm just playing with it just to see what it kind of looks like. But for most people, normally it isn't something you'd necessarily need to do. However, if you're promoting your business, if you're self-employed, consultant, that type of thing, you might consider turning on creator mode because it helps your information to sit more prominent in the profile in terms of the different areas. So just worth noting that there's two different types of profiles when it comes to LinkedIn, a creator or a non-creator. The non-creator is what we're most frequently used to. The creators are the new thing. The other thing that's also worth noting is all to do with the areas of a profile. And what I mean by that is there are multiple sections within LinkedIn. So we've got the initial introduction information. We've then got the about statement, which I'll come on to in a bit. We've got the featured content. And then within the background, this is kind of more like we'd expect to see from a CV. There's then additionally skills area, but there's also then this accomplishments. And accomplishments then covers a number of areas. So publications, patents, courses, project honors, awards, test scores, so on and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean you need to give your inside leg measurements and everything else, but what you do want to think about is what's important to a reader based on what you want them to know. So if there are things that you've done which was standout achievements, or there are things done that you're very proud of, or there are things that you want to go into greater detail of, do make sure you take advantage of the different sections available to you within your profile. So it's not just about what you've done and where you've done it, it's also about additional information that you may wish to think about and highlight. Now, the reason I'm flagging this now is because when we start to look at in a second profiles, what we always want to think about is what do we want the reader to have in mind? What's important in terms of the message? And what we're going to start with is we're going to start with what I term the headline. Now, the headline is slightly more than just text. So if I just scroll down quickly, here we are. So here's Joss as an example. So Joss, 5 minutes ago, shared this information. What we have initially is a photograph with a green dot that's solid, which means he's currently live on the site. What we also then obviously have is his name, and then we also have his headline or a sequence of statements. Now, this headline or sequence of statements, in his case, he's called Chief Encouragement Officer, Leadership Coach, Employee Experience. If I hover over him, it actually tells me he's an Employee Experience Consultant. Now, this headline, this name, and this photograph is what we see when we're navigating through the site, whether it's from our home feed, whether it's from content being shared, whether it's when other people interact with information. Or in the case on the right-hand side, we've got it with Theopathitis, we've got it with Ben, we've got it with Timothy. The thing with each of these three is they're all very different. So what we want to think about as an initial starting point is, well, actually, what do we want that catch to be to encourage somebody to look at us further if our ambition is to be seen by others? Now, the default for most people is similar to what Timothy has, which is job at company, or what Theo has, which is job at company. The problem with job at company is all too often it can be generic, or it can incorporate titles or phrases or similar that just mean nothing to nobody. Now, hopefully you'll be pleased to learn that actually the headline itself is free text, and we do have the ability to use up to 220 characters as a way to be able to introduce further information about you. But the reason this is important, as I say, is it starts to give that indication of who you are or what you do or what you offer. So that headline, as I say, is continually and always visible throughout the platform. So we want to start to bear that in mind. So there we go. Let's take James, just because why not? He's here 1 minute ago. He's just posted a piece. So he's moving units, but let's just jump into James's profile. So that headline, that photograph, that name is what's going to encourage us to view somebody initially. But when it comes to building a profile with regards to your own, there's a few things we want to think about. We've got that initial information, but if we were to think about LinkedIn in a slightly different way, so if we were to think about LinkedIn actually as being a library and every profile being a book, that photograph, that name, that headline, as we see here under the people also viewed on the right-hand side, is kind of the equivalent to the spine of a book. Once we then choose to click on the individual, what that then does is it gives us something I'd say more equivalent to a front cover of a book. So in James's case, we've now got a background image. I like it, I must admit. It's London as a skyline, though it looks reasonably old, just because there's a lack of large buildings and construction more than anything else. But we've got a background image. What we then have is we've got a bit further by way of information. So I can see that he's based in London. I can see we've got he's got 500 connections, 6 of whom are in common. I can see where he says he works, what he says he does. And then if I go into the about section, this is where I then get to learn a bit more about him. Now, the about section is what I'd almost liken to the back of a book. So if we're using the book analogy, and we've seen the front cover, the about section is about the author, which is the whole who he is, what does he do, he, she, whoever it may be, as a way to then discover. Now, the thing with the about section is you've got 2,500 characters in terms of space to create a message. Please don't use them all. But this is where people are going to initially start to understand who you are or what the message is in terms of what you want people to be aware of about you. So in James's case, he describes himself as being a professional, capable, enthusiastic former infantry officer, passion for politics, working at Westminster, but also involved as a property portfolio, committed to continual professional development, always looking for like-minded people to connect with. So he kind of gives us a bit by way of information. A bit further down, we've then got a podcast that he's chosen to host. We've then got some content in terms of what he's then been up to. And then further in, we then get to start to see what he's doing, what he's involved with, and also further down where he's been previously. So it allows us to go through as much or as little detail as we want. And in James's case, what he's also chosen to do is provide us with other resources. So we've got things like documents or web links as a means to discover further. And it goes all the way back in terms of his earlier career, what he's been doing, so on and so forth, all the way back to, in this case, his forces. Now, when it comes to a profile within LinkedIn, how much you say, how far back you go, what detail you provide, it's all entirely up to you. But it's all based on what is the message you're looking to try and get across. Now, there are some things that I'd always recommend. Now, the first thing I would always recommend when it comes to a LinkedIn profile is be consistent with tone. So if I was going to be critical of James, I mean this in a very nice way, and I will tell him to be fair, is that actually in some cases, he's very personable. So, I conducted, I studied, etc., etc. And then we've got here, this is what I describe as being more of a neutral style. Then if we go a bit further up into his forces work, again, all neutral. But then if we go into the more recent work, particularly at the top, it's very much written as first person, I did, I've been involved with, I run, I do. And the problem with something like this, not in a big way, but the only issue that can come from this is that actually it gives a very different tone as somebody reads through the information. Because one of the things, again, we don't know is we don't know whether somebody's reading the information live on the site or if the information is actually being read externally. Now, the way it can be read externally is by somebody going to the tab More, because under More, they can save it to a PDF. What that then means is, as the name suggests, is you literally end up with a text version of the person's profile. And this is fairly common that people will extract the text-only version of a profile and then actually extrapolate the information from it or read through. So from a consistency perspective, I'm personally a fan of making sure things are consistent throughout. Otherwise, it very much gives the intention that, or the expectation or impression rather, that things were written at different stages and phases, and the chances are they were, but you should always look to bring everything up to the same speed and to the same point of reference, rather than just keep adding to the information as you go. So please do start to think about this as we go with the information, particularly around language and tone. Now, things that we also want to then think about is length and style, length and language. What I mean by that, well, from a paragraph perspective, I'd recommend that each paragraph, if you have multiple, is no more than 4 lines, or more importantly, 2 sentences. And the rationale for 4 lines or 2 sentences is really simple. Firstly, for 4 lines, the reason being is that anything greater than that tends to become too blocky as text, becomes very concentrated, it's very difficult to actually extract and read from. The other reason then instead for using 2 sentences is that the advantage of a sentence is clearly you're making a statement. If you've got a paragraph that has multiple sentences, then it can mean that people skim read and actually miss the information that you're looking to try and highlight to somebody in terms of the importance. So we do want to think about how the information is read from the perspective of the reader, whether them being viewing you on the mobile, whether them being viewing you on the desktop, or as we showed a second ago, actually them extracting your profile as a PDF. We want it to be easy and clear to read. From a detail perspective, particularly when we get into the areas such as experience, what we want to do is make sure that the detail we include here really focuses on what's important and what's relevant, not just I say it on my CV. And the reason I want to say this is because actually all too often people just copy and paste a CV because it's an easy thing to do, or they think, well, I'm using it to get a job, therefore I need to include CV data. It's not about CV, it's about the message and the impression and the information you need to disclose, which then means when it comes to the comms or the information, you want to give people a sense of who you are, what you do, what you've done in the about section. And in the experience section, we want to then give people things like a sense of what I describe as size, scale, and scope. So to give people an understanding, well, where do you sit, what you're doing, what you're involved with, what's the remit, what's the understanding, to just give people a clearer idea of what you do. And particularly for those of you who are perhaps still serving or have perhaps only recently left, the bulk of your content within the experience section is going to be your serving history. So what we want to then do is not just talk about a title and give it a generic phrase. What we want to do is try and give a bit of a sense to a position. Now, that doesn't mean we disclose things that we're not comfortable with. You only ever disclose things that you are comfortable with. So the sense of information might talk about size of team or scope of involvement or seniority in terms of decision making, rather than necessary specifics of what the actions were or what you delivered against or what you did. Now, it's all easy for me to kind of sit here and say it's not a CV, or there's certain things that you should and shouldn't disclose. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about what you're most comfortable with and what you feel you need to say to get across the message to somebody who's not sat next to you reading it. Because for some people, actually, there can be an argument that less is more, and you'll want to just give more brevity towards what you do, or a simpler way to disclose what you're about and what you're focused on. But it's all to do with what you're most comfortable with. That all said, there are a few things that I would personally advise as a must. The musts are, to start with, a decent photograph. Now, the decent photograph doesn't mean it needs to be professional. What it does mean, though, is it means it needs to be clear. You need people to be able to see you in the image. So to give you an example of what I mean, I'm just going to jump into the site quickly. And if I then just go to people, what I've now got is a list of individuals. So I've got Richard coming back, and then I've got Jeff, then I've got Chris, then I've got Andrea, then I've got Mel, then I've got Chet, Achen, so on and so forth. Now, each and every one of these photographs gives an impression. Does it need to be a staged photo? Absolutely not. But as we look through a list, when there is no headshot, often it's kind of can raise a question as to why there's no headshot, firstly, or alternatively, with no headshot, actually the eye tends to just simply glaze over it. When there's a headshot, but it's muddled, and what I mean by that is difficult to then extract. So if I take Chris as an example, though I like Chris's headshot because of what he's about, because he works for Toast Ale and he is head of partnership, so it does make sense that he has a headshot with him with beer. Having said that, he needs to get a better resolution shot and maybe wear a different colored shirt so we don't lose the actual labels of the bottles as well, because from a distance it's kind of not 100% clear on what he's about and what he's doing, particularly given his title of Global Head of Partnerships. Doesn't actually talk about the fact that he's global head of partnerships at Toast Ale, and it therefore makes more sense as to why he's showing beer in his headshot. So we do want to make sure there's some consistency and actually maybe some information and insight with it, rather than necessarily not having something. Commonly, you often see people with headshots try and manipulate them, and what I mean by that is they might do things like put a different colored circle around the edge. One of the most common circles that people tend to see at the moment, or one of the two rather, is there's a headshot where there's a blue banner, sorry, purple banner rather, that says I'm hiring. Alternatively, there's a green banner that says open to work. I'm personally not a big fan, but again, it's about what you're comfortable with as much as anything else. So we do want to think about how we're looking to stage the information, but a headshot personally is a must. A clear headshot making it easy to see you, absolutely. When it comes to then the next piece of information that's really important, it's then down to the who you are. So if I take Mike, for example, who's the CEO of the BPA, I like what he says here. He explains his history of why he's able to do the job that he does. My only issue with it, if I have, well, two issues rather, if I'm going to be brutally honest. One is, again, back to the paragraph length. It's a little bit difficult to extrapolate all the information from. The other thing with it as well is that every sentence he has reads I mean, it's great to show it's personable in terms of tone and language, but maybe think about alternative options in terms of openers and not just I all the time. I mean, that all said, it is a good starting point without a doubt. And, if you were to read just these two paragraphs, it gives you a pretty good understanding as to who he is, what he does, what he's about. So to one of the questions that's been raised, how important is an about section? For me personally, massively important. And the single reason being is it's where you get to set out your stall. It's what you're about. It's why you want to be seen the way you want to be seen. It's what you do and similar. So do certainly think about that. Does it need to be a copy and paste from a CV? Personally, I wouldn't recommend it for the about section. But what we do want to think about is managing length, size, type, etc. When it comes to a question that's just come through, though, just going back in terms of imagery, there's a question around should it be black and white? Should it be color? Again, similarly, I've no problems either way, as long as people can see you. Sometimes not everybody suits black and white. So again, it's about how you color it or how clear it is, I suppose, would be the other piece as well. So to give you an example, though his photograph isn't quite black and white, but it's pretty darn close to it. Paul's headshot here, it kind of feels like he's put an Instagram filter over it for some random reason. I kind of almost can't see him, so I'm not a big fan of that. Equally as well, I mean, I talk about color. If I take Owen, I don't know who he is, but the color of his shirt and the color of the background, I mean, his head pops, I suppose, but the rest of it kind of can wash away a little bit. So you just want to be mindful of that, I suppose, as much as anything else. But there is no right or wrong. It's more to do with what you feel is right for you based on how you want to be seen. The other piece, though, I would point out when it comes to headshots in particular is please make sure they're reasonably recent. I do remember a very funny incident before lockdown where I was in a coffee shop, quite well known one, popular for meetings, and somebody was sat there and somebody else was walking around attempting to find the person they were due to meet, and the individual they were due to meet was sat on a different table to the one they asked at. And when the individual pointed out that they were the person they were due to meet, you could kind of see the person respond like, that's not how you look on LinkedIn. So do make sure that they're up to date, or at least logical in terms of why you look the way you do, please. Right. So hopefully, kind of starting points, we really want to make sure the information starts to build as we go. Now, when it comes to back to the profile, as I say, there's no right or wrong. Well, that's not true. Wrong is a copy of a CV, because it should not be a copy of a CV. And a wrong is where you overemphasize previous experience that you don't want to do again. When it comes to creating a profile that's right for you, as I say, it's about thinking of it more in the context of what would you tell somebody over a coffee? What would you disclose by way of information that you're comfortable with anybody knowing? Because that's certainly how we want to treat the information as well as we go. Now, to give you some examples of different ways in which we can go about doing this, as I say, different people will construct it in different ways. But if I take Ian as a starting point, so here's Ian. So if we take it from the off in terms of what we start to see. So photograph, I mean, clearly not a corporate photo, but to be fair, I can see him, I can recognize him, and it's pretty recent, so that kind of works. Outdoorsy piece in terms of the background, well, that kind of goes then with the background image in terms of what we're then seeing in terms of the mountain and the lake behind. Why does he have the mountain and the lake behind? Well, a lot of that's to do with the fact that actually if you have a background image, it can be a nice way to deliver a further message rather than it necessarily being held separately. Further down within, what we then start to see, obviously, is where he's based, and more importantly, what he says he does in terms of his headline. Now, what I really do like about his headline in terms of information is that it leads in terms of the information. What I mean by that is the initial statement that starts refers to the fact that he's interim, which means he's not looking for a permanent role. He's executive and consultant, which is more to do with the level of seniority, and the consultant is kind of a similar phrase to interim anyway. The next two statements, though, really more talk to the type of function that he performs as an interim, so CEO, COO, and then the next four statements rather refer to the situation that the organization finds themselves in or why he's typically brought in. So it's quite a nice way to simply position. Now, technically, if we went with the LinkedIn version of what he should say, it would then say something along the lines of owner at Kinder Edge Limited, which means bugger all to anybody. So it's a nice way to really be able to introduce the who you are. When it comes to the about section, he has an exceptionally brief about section. Having said that, it says a lot by way of information. So we've got, again, seniority of what he does. From a keyword perspective, he's using 3 terms that are very similar, but it means he can be discovered, and bear in mind your whole profile is keyword searchable. He then talks about the fact that he has global experience both as an exec and as a non. He also talks about being public and private companies, both regulated and non. He then talks about the sectors or markets that he's worked across as well. And this simple sentence is a very clear way of saying basically what he can do. The approach I quite like, and the reason I like the approach is because, again, a lot of what Ian's doing is he's going into organizations to assist in change. And one of the things Ian recognizes is the largest viewer of his profile are people who are employed at the company he's joining to help solve the problem. So actually, if he talks about the fact that he provides leadership and focus and a sense of urgency, well, it can set the tone in terms of what people can expect of him. The advantage then in the specialities area, though this is becoming less common, is all to again do with keyword searchable, because your whole world profile is keyword searchable. It's a nice way for the information to be seen. If we then go further down, again, there's reasons for saying what he says. So in the case of Kinder Edge, again, we can see a one-liner, or one sentence rather, talking about what he does. Now, why doesn't he disclose clients or examples or information? Probably because he's not able to, because of his relationships with the companies, and they don't necessarily want to be public. Having said that, what he does do further down is when he can talk about it, he does. So he gives a title to what he does, and he's always very conscious of making sure he states everything as being interim. Main reason being HMRC do use LinkedIn data when understanding employment statuses, so do make sure you disclose yourself properly. But then you can get a sense as to what he was doing. So enterprise-wide transformation, or strategic transformation operational projects, or working with the CEO to sell the business. So you can start to get a sense in a very simple way what it's about. Now, arguably, given some of the roles he's performed, there is an element of less is more, particularly at the seniority level for which he runs at. But even if we go further back to his earlier career, we can, where the detail makes sense, he describes it in detail. So after leaving O2, he went and had a 6-month period of time off. And so he talks about what he did then before he went back into work. So it's about the message that you want a reader to have for you. The other piece he'll do as well is he is providing a complete history. So he did start out as an army officer in the Royal Engineers. If you were to have looked at this profile 10 years ago, there was then information under this. But as his career has progressed, he's lessened the information throughout because it becomes less relevant. He's not going to hide it because it's still who he is and how he's come to be. Well, but the weighting is in direct correlation with the importance to what he feels he needs a reader to know. Now, arguably, in some respects, particularly with things like a CV, actually going back this far is not necessarily that common. But with LinkedIn, we're given the scope too, so there's no reason to not include it. So it will enable you to go back through quite substantially to create the information. Now, what Ian's also done nicely is he's taken the first 14 years of his working career and literally wrapped them. What do I mean by that? Well, he's lumped 5 years Royal Engineers under one, and he's lumped 9 years of BT under another. So you don't always have to separate and show every single position. It's all to do with what you're comfortable with and what's appropriate. From an educational perspective, he's chosen to show both his development programs as well as his, in this case, degree and some of his earlier learnings as well. And if we go a bit further in, then what he's also chosen to incorporate is skills and endorsements. Principle behind skills and endorsements is, as the name suggests, it's a way for you to be able to disclose skills you feel you have and then have them endorsed by others from your network. The one comment I'd make to this is that I have seen a ridiculously high number of individuals off this session who've got things like skills for firing a gun, or what was one I saw the other day? Warfare. Fabulous, understand it, but it's about what's important to your audience. So do make sure you weight and base the information accordingly in terms of what's important to you. So do build that through. In Ian's case, he's chosen to go back and provide quite a lot of detail. Each of the green ticks is where I've chosen to endorse him because I've seen him do those things. But it's a way for you to be able to create a slightly completer picture for you as an individual. The one comment I'd make, again, around the skills area, beyond having the right ones listed, is please shy away from listing everything you think you need to tell people. It's not to say that you don't know lots of stuff, but you want to make sure that you weight it in order as to what's important to you, because you are limited to only a maximum of 50 skills available within a profile. So do think about kind of how you pull all that together. Further down within the area of such as recommendations, I'm a huge fan of recommendations. Not everybody is, but the reason I'm a huge fan of recommendations is it's a nice way for somebody to be able to validate and prove you do what you claim to do. And it's in their words, not yours. It can be a really nice way to position things. With recommendations, the one comment I would definitely make though is provide as well as receive. So in Ian's case, he's chosen to give a number of recommendations as well. So it's not just all about what do I do. It's a really nice way to also show the stuff that you feel others can do and how you can benefit them also. So do think of a balance in terms of the information that you can strike within the profile. And then finally, within a profile, everybody has an interest area of some description. Interest area covers, in Ian's case, the companies he follows, as well as the groups he's a member of, as well as the schools that he follows also. Now, none of this is an issue as long as you're comfortable in showing people you follow what you follow. One thing to bear in mind when it comes to the companies area in particular, the companies you follow comes about because you say you're employed there or you've worked there, or it's a company you've chosen to follow. Or the third reason as to why companies appear is because you have applied for a job. So please make sure that all the organizations you then have listed are ones that you want to be listed against or associated with. If you don't, then simply unfollow to remove it from your profile. Now, when it comes to building a decent profile, the big thing as well is please build it offline, not on LinkedIn. Word document, take it separately, start to construct the message in terms of what you want people to know, start to pull it together in terms of all the insight, messaging, so on and so forth. Now, to give you an idea in terms of length and time, if you've got a decent CV and you already know what that information needs to look like, or you have that rather to work from, and if you know that actually what you want to be pulling together is going to be something that will just take a bit of time, but not the end of the world. You know, it's the sort of thing that you want to make sure that you construct over a period of time. Now, when it comes to that information, Word document is definitely the easiest way to start. And to give you an idea, I use something similar to this. So this is a template that I use with individuals. Hopefully you can all see that on screen. But the template is, career narrative, getting you started. Then I walk people through. I've just realized this is somebody's, so let me just get a different example of one that hasn't been used. Bear with me. Yeah, here we are. So right, so here we are. So yeah, career narrative, thinking about things that are important. So what are the themes that we want to be creating? Then we go into talk about actually to date, what have you been doing? Oops. Can't see it, bear with me. Thanks guys for telling me. Here we go. So hopefully you can see it now. So what we've got in then is things to consider. As I say, it's not a CV. So how do you describe your career today? What is the narrative? What are the pivotal points in terms of your career? And what are the themes that underlie the experience? Then I get people to talk about, on reflection, what have you enjoyed? Are there particular standout events that have taken shape that have really helped you get to where you are, honed your experience, that again, we want to perhaps start to think about? And ideally, we're going to get 5 that we might then want to think about ranking. What we then do is we start to then think about the content of the profile. So what are the messages by way of imagery that we want to be looking to conceive and create? What's the type of statement that we want to make around our profile? And then where do we want to be seen to be? And are there additional resources that might support that? What I then get people to do is start to then think about them. So as I was saying, in no more than 5 paragraphs ideally, and 2 sentences, 4 lines per para, we want people to understand who you are, what you do or have done, and what you want them to be aware of. So what are you looking to try and tell? What are you looking to try and create? What do you want people to learn from, given you're not there to explain it? What I then do is get people to start to talk about their experience to date, and then taking each role, we want to give a sense of scope of role, responsibility, and also scale of involvement. So where you sat, what it did, what it meant. I've had a couple of people send me messages. Yes, I will send this to Victoria, so you guys can use this as a template to help you. I'm not sure if the OA have got anything else, but I'll send it through, no problems. But like I say, it's just breaking it down just to help you think about it. As I say, building it offline is a really important activity. Because it means you then spell check it, you grammar check it, you have it sat the way you want it to, and you take the time through it in terms of constructing the information. So please, please, please make sure that we look to do it that way. So to those of you, to the number of you who've asked, yeah, I will send you, I'll make sure that becomes available to you. Okay. So coming back to then Ian, a couple other things then just to set expectations. Building a profile is going to be something that will probably take you 4 to 6 hours, being realistic. And that's obviously thinking time. That's not, it takes you that long to type. But it's just going to be something that you'll want to construct and pull together when appropriate, but it will take time. It's not a knee-jerk thing. It's not something you should just produce and do. It's also something that you won't do in one go. What you'll do is you'll create probably initially a skeletal profile, which is the kind of the basics of, the things you're proud of, the achievements you want to disclose, your education, your employment, in terms of date, company history, etc. But then the detail may be something you then add to going forward as you go. But like I say, we want to make sure that it's something that we do and we take time in terms of pulling it all together. So producing and pulling together a decent profile, let's say 4 to 6 hours is probably a realistic amount of time to consider when you start to sit down and do it. But it is not a start at 10 and finish by 2 or 4 with no coffee. It doesn't work like that. So I'm just going to shut up for a second and just see if anybody's got any questions then around building a profile. If there's anything I've not covered, please make sure you throw it in either the Q&A or in the chat. So I'm just going to pause for 1 sec. Okay, in that case, I'm assuming most people are pretty comfortable with what we've then covered so far today in terms of profile information. Just from a kind of an amount perspective, a CV versus a LinkedIn profile, you're typically looking somewhere in the region of about 30% of a CV will come into a LinkedIn profile. but it's more common that a LinkedIn profile will be longer than a CV, particularly because it gives us that opportunity to explain things in detail, introduce other information, but again, always with an eye to what's important to your reader, or with the thought of, I'm not there to explain it, does it make sense? Because in particular, there are often titles that just mean nothing. So we want to think about how we contextualize it, which is again, to the detail around experience, how we might want to then think about the information that appears within. Okay, so it's going to be something, as I say, that will take its time and start to come together. So once we start to pull it all together, it's also going to be a bit of a work in progress hand in hand with actually starting to engage within the site as well. Now, by engagement, what I mean by that is I'm talking about starting to utilize the platform and gather information that will also help things like build a CV. So when it comes to building a decent, sorry, not build a CV, build a profile rather. When it comes to building a decent profile, clearly you're going to start with your CV and start to accrue information from that. You're going to be using the Word document, possibly the template if you wish to, as a means to start to pull it all together. But what you also want to do is do some research. And the research comes in a couple of different forms. The first piece of research comes in the form of, what do other people do? Now, that's not to say you're going to plagiarize, but what you might want to do is think about how you might disclose information. So I'm going to pinch Jonathan, or use Jonathan rather, as an example to start this. So if I go to Jonathan's profile, I'm sure he doesn't mind, and some of you may well know him anyway, but if we go into him, so we've got a headshot or slightly more distance photo, but we can see it's him in the city. London is a skyline image that I do jest. He doesn't live in London. We then see a headline. So his headline talks about him being a coach to chairman, CEOs, exec teams, broadcaster, entrepreneur, and a team coach. And then if we start to then go in, we've then got a who is he and what does he do? So if I was going to be critical of him, again, I will tell him, however, he really needs to separate and punctuate his paragraphs properly. He's tried, he just hasn't done that double line space. I do like the fact this is very personable and particularly relevant given the type of work that he does. And also he talks about examples of clients and areas he's worked with. With something like that, particularly his last sentence, please only do so if you have permission from the client. So always, again, be aware in terms of what you're doing and what you're about. If I go a bit further down, though, what he's also then chosen to do is in detail, again, talk about what he offers, what he's involved with, where he's been working, and he provides the detail where appropriate in disclosing or talking about the work that he's involved with, all the things that he does. Going back into his earlier career, again, if it's important, he discloses it further. If it's not, then he doesn't so much. But the comment I would make with all of this and each of this is that actually at times, again, he's got that classic job title that means nothing. One of the things I do quite like, however, is the way in which he summarizes his 20 years in the forces, because actually he encapsulates it quite nicely, but also it gives a good understanding as to what he's about and what he did. Though the only criticism, I can see it just as I look at this now, for some reason, he talks about 12,500 officers and troops from 96 to 2001, which he then says in 2000 he left the army and then joined PwC. So that doesn't quite correlate. I'll pull him up on a few things today then, I think. But why am I saying this is quite nice? Again, it's about the detail that's relevant in terms of how he wants to be seen and shown. So if you wanted to emulate somebody like Jonathan, not say you would, but what we can do is, as we did earlier, is we can take that profile, we can drop it into a PDF, and we can save it for later. Now that's all good and well if you know the people you want to look up, but if you're not familiar or less familiar with who you actually want to look up or you want to get an understanding from, what we do instead is we start to gather information from within the site. So if I go to the search bar across the top and press the return key, what I then get is a list of different areas within LinkedIn. And where I'm going to go is I'm actually going to go to the people area, because what I'm interested in is I'm interested in looking at the 700 million people on the site. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to choose the option which is called all filter. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to discover profiles on LinkedIn of people that I want to just get an idea from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take people based in the UK. And what I'm also then going to do is I'm going to take past company, add an organization, and I'm going to chuck in the Royal Navy. So as I type it in, find the correct organization, select it. So I've now got Royal Navy, UK, show results. I've now got 29,000 individuals coming back matching. Now, what I could then do at this point is I could then go and start to take a look at these individuals if I wish to. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to add another filter. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to take people who are working in a particular sector I'm interested in. So I'm going to take, for argument's sake, financial services. I'm also going to choose banking, both standard and investment. Now, why am I choosing those three areas? Well, because that might be where I'm interested. Show results. I go from 29,000 to 700. I now then have a list of who those individuals are. Now, I'm able to see these people because I know them through other individuals. So if I take Rob as an example, I don't know him individually, but we know 5 people in common. I can see that he describes himself as being a CIO, strategic transformation board exec. He's at Leeds Building Society. I can then see what he says and what he details. And in fact, actually, given the type of work he does, using almost a quasi bullet point makes an awful lot of sense. A bit further down, then I can start to then see what he does and how much detail he chooses to provide. And then further down, I can see what he's done and where he's done it. Now, this is quite nice. And again, I don't know Rob, but I get a very quick sense as to, well, what is the division or what is the area or what did he have? So it can help me understand where he sits within an organization, and using the phrase I referred to earlier, a sense of size, scale, and scope, it can give me that kind of understanding as to what he's doing. Again, similarly, further down, I can go back through his earlier career, and again, there's less information as we go further down. If I was to be critical in terms of some of what we've got here, we've got some mixed information in terms of dates. So some of them are year to year, others are month to year. Be consistent whichever way you go. But again, similarly, so he was a lieutenant, retired, left out in 2000, and then worked his way through. So you can start to see the route for which somebody has taken and how they've come to be. Again, we don't necessarily need to know who the individual is, but we can start to glean some understanding as to how they showcase or what they disclose or how they talk about things. So you can do some research from others as a way to start to help you think about how you may want to position your own profile. The other piece that you also may want to think about doing, particularly again in relation to your building of a profile, is if your primary purpose is looking to use it for a career change, what we then want to start to do is we want to start to get an assumption, or make an assumption rather, of what people look for based on other known information. Now, what do I mean by that? So a grand statement. What I basically mean is, what do they say in job ads that I'm interested in, that I might want to also incorporate in my own profile? That's what we're doing. So the way we're able to go through and start to research potential opportunities is by going into the jobs area. Now, within the jobs area, you'll always by default have a series of suggested searches, and that's based on your pre-existing content in your profile. What you'll also have further down are recommended positions for you. And again, that's based on what do you say in your profile today in terms of the information. So you've got various things then coming through. But let's say, for argument's sake, what I'm actually interested in is a particular job. So let's say I want to be a program manager, fabulous catch-all. So I'm going to take program manager as a title, leaving the location open. I've now got almost 6,000 jobs in the UK coming back matching. What I can then do is I can then start to filter them. So I'm going to go into all filter, and what I'm going to do this time now is I'm going to say, well, my seniority is, let's say I'm mid to senior director level, and let's say I'm looking for a full-time or contract position. Argument's sake, I want to be in London, and then the industry. So I could disclose an industry. I'm going to take just these 3 to start with, however, because I've got 378 matching results. So I can now start to see what some of these positions are that are coming back through. Now, obviously, we've got a whole bunch of stuff coming from a wide variety of industries and markets and sectors. So at this point now, what I'm going to do then is just, oops, apologies, wrong button. Let's go back into all filters. So I will choose an industry just to make life easier. So I'm going to take FS. So I've now got 80 positions coming back. So various roles coming through. So let's take one of these roles. So let's take the program manager cyber data access. So as I jump into it, I get to then see title, location of the role, and similar, when it was advertised. I can then see there's one connection there. Well, actually, it's because it's a recruitment company that is looking to actually, sorry, Access Capital is actually the business is looking to recruit. Gary is the talent acquisition person. And what I then see is a pretty lengthy requirement in terms of details. So what I'm going to do instead is, as I look at this information, what I'm going to do is nab sections of it. So I'm going to nab the general description and I'm going to copy it. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to go to a thing called a word cloud generator. For those of you not familiar with a word cloud generator is basically just a counting algorithm. And what it does is it allows you to take text or information, and it then shows you how frequently something appears based on size. So the words I've just copied across from that description, it tells me business and identify and initiatives are the things that come back most. But what I can do then is actually amend it and say, well, what are the 30 top words? And I can see, so we've got terms such as task and timeline and technology. We've got phrases such as data and resources, etc. So what we can do is we can start to get a sense as to what information is disclosed in the job ad that we might want to also then introduce ourselves into our own profiles, particularly if there is commonality or certain statements made. If I go into the second area, which is the principal's duty and responsibility, again, similarly, I can copy and paste that through and again get a sense as to what they seem to be asking for or what they want. So it can be a really nice way to help you start to emphasize and reference things that seem to be important based on how they're being asked for. So really, really worthwhile, particularly in building your profile, to gather intelligence from job adverts that you're interested in, and then look to disclose and utilize that information in how you talk about yourself. Particularly relevant also, given that you may well end up using language terms or phrases that you know what they mean, but nobody else has a clue. So you can use it as a way to help you think about breaking language or altering language and the type of information that also comes back as well. So do think about taking the time in terms of pulling that all together. So in terms of a research piece, we do two things for our profile. We either research based, as I say, we start by researching based on information appearing within our profile, sorry, appearing in other people's profiles rather, and also we research based on job opportunities that are coming through as well. Clearly, if you are in that looking at opportunities piece, obviously when you are performing a search for roles that are coming back that you think are interesting, what you should also then think about doing is turning on an alert. And then you can actually then have an alert that then comes through to you on a daily or a weekly basis. So in this case, by default, it's a daily email and notification, and then it can give you some suggestions in terms of the information. You can keep an eye on what's coming through as well. I don't want to be a program manager in financial services in London, so I'm going to delete that. But it does mean you can then start to have alerts of opportunities that are coming through to you to help you start to understand what's coming, what types of things are being requested or asked for, or what types of data or information are being set. So really, really worthwhile going through and taking some time to think about as much as anything else. Okay, just going to pause for a second then and see if anything's come through on the Q&A or chat further around actually building profiles or similar. Cool. All right. All good. So coming back then, like I say, the profile is going to be something that will take time. This is one of the reasons why it's 4 to 6 hours. You're going to do a bit of time in terms of researching, gathering information, intelligence, etc., pulling it all together to really make life much, much info. Okay, sorry, John. I did say it was going to be an intense 2 hours. Anyway, we've still got half an hour to go. So coming back to the site though, and coming back to kind of next steps, as I say, it's about utilizing the site as well in terms of kind of working our way through. So something I want to a couple of things rather, I just want to quickly highlight just to help you also think about utilizing the site further. So it's less about then, as I say, your profile. It's more about kind of getting some actions through it, particularly for those of you who've been on the site for a while. Now, one of the things I want to just start to show you then is actually the networking aspect of the site also. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about the networking aspect from individuals, that we can cover that. But what I want to do is start again from that kind of intelligence information piece and quasi-networking that can come off the back of groups. So, because what might be happening is you may well have just started using LinkedIn, in which case you might not have much of a network to be able to utilize, to be able to see people, to be able to learn in terms of what other people are doing. So if what we do instead, however, is by joining a group, once we're accepted into that group, the other group members become accessible to us because they're in our network based on the fact they belong to the same group. So it enables us to start to perform the research in terms of gathering and positioning and understanding without needing to build a network. So the way we go about gathering and joining groups is, again, by clicking into the search bar, choose return. We then get, again, the sequence of options for us, and we go to then groups. Within groups, there are now 2.1 million groups on LinkedIn, which is just a ridiculous number. Most of them are not the best, but some of them can be very, very powerful. So as we view groups at the moment, it's showing you the groups I'm a member of, but what we can do then is perform a keyword search against it. So for example, type in British Army as a group name. There are 60 then coming back, and we can then see there are some specific groups based on different elements and areas within the Army. Now, one of the things that you'll often find is in some cases they're quite well maintained and run. So if we take the Royal Artillery, for example, they have a pretty good descriptor of what are the rules. So what are you doing and what are you about? So there's certain elements that are expected. And one of the things that you'll often find is you may well find that people will actually reach out to you. And in the case of Simon, who runs this group, he may well query who you are or why you're looking to join based on what you say within your profile. So some groups are very well managed and very well run, others less so, and it really does vary massively. One group, however, that might be worth taking a look at is if we just type in OA, we can find a group called OA Connect. Now, it's not a particularly active group, though it's reasonably so. We can see Tony 3 days ago shared some information around some job opportunities at Balfour Beatty. But the advantage of this group is there's well over 1,000 members now. This is a group designed for people who have been through the support from the OA. So given the fact that you're all on here, whether you've signed up formally with the OA or not, what you might want to think about doing is joining the OA Connect group for the purpose of seeing what's being disclosed and the information shared, but also, more importantly, you get to also see who the other members are. And as I say, even though you might not be connected to them, based on the fact that you both belong to the same group, it then gives you the ability to then go in and see who they are and what they do, or where they've worked or similar. So well worth utilizing group memberships for the purpose of understanding what people are saying, how they're saying, what they're disclosing, so on and so forth. So well worth going in and doing. So we can start to participate and become more active within the platform through joining groups. We can use it then from a research perspective. Really, really worthwhile doing. Alternatively, you may want to actually reach out and connect to people to start with. Maybe there'll be a close circle of friends, former colleagues, or similar that you want to deal with, or you might receive invitations yourself to connect. So if I just go back into search, if we want to find somebody that we want to connect to, what we can go back and do is we can go to the people options. Once we go to people, we then go to filter, and what we then do is we can start to track people down. So what I'll do is scroll all the way to the bottom, and then I can find people by name. So let's say I want to find my mate called David Jones, and I want David because David used to be in the forces. So I'm going to go up and say that his past company is likely to be, can't spell today. Let's say they're going to have been in the British Army. Oops. So I've got BA as a former employer. If I go down, we've got Dave Jones as a name, or David Jones, and there are 19. It's not surprising because there's bound to be at least one. So what we now have is a list of the people. This is, again, it leads us on to what I was commenting on earlier. This is where things like headshot are really important, because it means I can see who the individual is and recognize whether it's the person I think they are. Clearly, if it's the person I recognize and know, what I then may want to do is then connect to them. Please don't then just hit connect, because by hitting connect, it will then send an invitation. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get the opportunity to provide a message as to why. If you want to remind the person as to why you know them or similar, what you do instead is go to their profile. It's an interesting angle, but you go to their profile. What you then do is hit connect. What you then do is add a note, and then you go, hey Dave, great to see you on here, how the devil are you, so on and so forth, send. Now sometimes, depending on somebody's settings, when you view a profile and you want to send them an invite to connect, it doesn't always give you the connect button. What it may do instead is you need to go to the option of more, and under more, you'll have an option here which will then say connect. Particularly true to the mobile. So if you ever try and connect to somebody on the mobile, don't press the connect button because it will just send with no opportunity to add an introductory note. What you want to do instead is find the more, or on the mobile it's 3 dots, and when by choosing that you can then look to express and send a message to people as a means to then be able to explain to them why you're reaching out. Biggie for me in terms of why you might want to do that. Well, you don't know what the recipient receives. You also don't necessarily know how they operate. But in my case, I get quite a high volume of invitations. At the moment, I've got 73 outstanding. If I go into see all, I can see all the different messages that I've got coming back. Now, the difficulty at times is I get messages from people, but it's not always obvious as to why. So one of the habits that I try and get into is rather than just simply accept, what I often do is query as to why somebody's looking to perhaps reach out. So what I typically tend to do is, rather than just ignore an invite, because what I don't want to do is ignore something if it's important, what I do instead is I have a bunch of stock standard responses that just make my life much, much easier. So to give you an idea, so Anisha, she's come through, there's no message. I'm not going to ignore because we know people in common, it might be useful. I'm going to go to message instead. So I can now send a response back to her. So I'm going to do, hi Anisha. And based on this, what I'm going to do is just take a fairly impersonal thanks, but who are you? So I've got a very simple thanks for the invite. Just want to check was intended for me, only there wasn't a personal note on the invitation. I'm most happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I'm always keen to know why you'd like to connect first. Fairly simple, fairly easy. Who are you? Send. Why am I doing that? I've not accepted the invitation to connect. I'm just querying as to who they are or why. Similarly, I'm going to do this if I go to Tyler, just have a quick look. Oxford Hill Consulting, based in Florida. Other than going there on holiday, don't know why we'd know each other. So what I'm going to do then is, again, similar message. Yeah, so hi Tyler. Now, rather than taking the one that I've just used, what I'm going to do instead is just grab something a bit different. I'm going to go with this one. It's a bit shorter. Thanks for the invitation. Typically, I connect with people when I've met them, but if you'd like to tell me why you'd like to connect and help me decide if we should. A bit short, but it's about what you feel is appropriate. So you can use different options when reaching out to individuals or responding to individuals. You don't always have to just simply accept. The rule I tend to run then is I tend to send a message. I try and send it reasonably quickly, and then I tend to give them a couple of weeks by way of a response. And then if they've not come back to me after a couple of weeks, I tend to just ignore. But it's just a way of being able to manage people in. And it's not to say I'm not willing to have people that I'm less familiar with or I don't know, but I'm always keen to know a reason as to why somebody wants to connect. I don't just simply need to connect or want to connect to lots of individuals. So think about how you might want to manage it in, and it can be quite a nice way to be able to actually then support some of that in terms of what you're doing or manage the network. If for any reason you do accept an invite and then later go, eek, I didn't mean to, all you need to do to remove somebody from your network is go to My Network. You then go to Connections. Under Connections, it will then list everybody whom you're connected to, starting with the most recent. And what you then do if you want to remove them is simply then go into the triple dot, and then you can remove them as a connection. They don't get a message saying you're no longer their friend, but what will happen is you will remove them. They'll be removed from your network. And it means then also they could technically work out. You're no longer connected, but unless they knew what they're doing, it's unlikely. The way they could technically work out what you're doing is, again, by going back to the network. You've got an option here called following, and this shows who you follow. So yeah, who you follow. But what you can also do is it means people can see who follows them. So I can see some of you today have chosen to follow me. Thanks, guys. So I can see you're following me. By default, when you connect to somebody, you follow them. So it means if you were to remove them from your network, they could technically see you have removed them if they went to this section and worked their way through. But obviously, if it's somebody that was a while ago, it's less likely for them to know that you've removed them from your network. It's basically more effort for them to sort it out, but they could technically work it out. I hope that makes sense. Okay, but what we want to do, as I say, is start to think about how we pull some of this together and start to kind of encapsulate it all. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a second, and then I just want to see if any messages have come through in terms of information or questions or otherwise. We've only got 15 minutes left. Okay. No. Okay, cool. Right. So if there's nothing else that's come through, then let's kind of cover a couple of other quick areas just in terms of really helping the site work a bit better for you as well. Going back to some of what I said earlier, obviously to start with, the thing to do is really to make sure you build, you sort rather your privacy in terms of what you're doing and sort your settings in terms of what's going on. And please, this is also something you do want to keep a regular eye on. Yeah, I've been a member of LinkedIn for almost 18 years. Over that time, I reckon I've received at most maybe a dozen messages from them saying they're changing stuff, but they have changed a lot. So if you're not a frequent user or you're mindful as to what might be out there about you online, please make sure you set aside some time and really kind of think it through a little bit. And what you might want to then do is diarize a time to always check it going forward. And also, it's not a bad thing to have a kind of a, every 2 months, just make sure you're comfortable with how things are set. It's a good idea to stay on top of this stuff. So think about that in terms of settings and privacy. Obviously, as I mentioned, your profile is something that isn't just a CV. It is something you want to accumulate over time and start to accrue, but very much taking it from the angle of what do I want a reader to know about me, not what do I feel I must tell everybody. Because obviously, again, that can lead to just overshare, too much information, and we don't want to get into trouble. What we also want to think about, though, is obviously have the site work for us. And again, depending as to how recently you've joined and or how frequently you use it, you may well find that there's things that you need to tweak as such. So what I mean by this is that you're probably, certainly if you've been using it for a while, it's highly likely that you've got that really annoying friend who seems to do nothing but go, look at me, I'm amazing, when it comes to LinkedIn. They do get a bit tiresome at times. But if you do have that type of friend, or not friend and just acquaintance or otherwise, one of the things you might want to think about doing is muting them. Now, the way you go about muting people, well, as I work my way through the site, and every time I come back to the homepage, we've seen that the homepage has been refreshed each time. Now, the content appearing with the homepage is content that's appearing based on what they think I'm most likely to interact with or be interested in. And it's described as being top content. If I change it, however, to recent, it will then resort it and say, well, this is what's happened most recently. So Trudy celebrated Hatuna's post, or if I go a bit further down, Trudy celebrated Shree's post. Or if I go a bit, okay, Trudy's busy, Trudy's celebrating quite a lot. And there's different content coming through. If for any reason, the information that I start to see are things that I'm actually just not that interested in, what I can do is then click the triple little dot and I can then unfollow the individual who led for the information to appear in front of me, or I can actually start to mute other individuals if I wish to. So I can actually stop content appearing to me from people I'm just not that interested in. Really, really handy. The other advantage of the triple dots is I can also save content for later, or I can take the information if I wish to and copy it elsewhere. Now, the advantage in saving for later clearly is that the thing with LinkedIn, particularly if you start to use it as a combination of mobile and desktop, which is highly likely to be the case as you start to use it more, actually coming back to the same place is pretty much impossible, particularly given the volume of information that gets shared through the site on a daily basis. So if you see stuff and go, do you know what, I want to read that later, what we will then want to do is using my items on the left hand side, this will take you back to the content that you have saved. So I've got jobs I've saved, I've got jobs I've posted, I've got my learning in terms of content, and then I've got saved posts. So this is it. It's articles that I've saved that I've then chosen or I want to come back to at a later state, or later date rather. Now, the advantage in saving these is also the fact that you're then feeding out LinkedIn's algorithm to help them understand as to what you're about, what you do, what you seem to be interested in, and similar. Because the more you start to interact with it and you start to set it the way you're interested in, then the better it's going to respond and the better it's going to produce in terms of results and information for you. Basically, it just becomes more meaningful. Why is it going to become more meaningful? The more you alter it, the more you tweak with it, the more you change it. Well, put simply, LinkedIn make money every minute you're on the site. So it's in their interest to try and retain you. So what they'll do is learn from what you seem to want to express an interest in or be interested in generally, and then they'll try and give you more of that to keep you here on the platform. That's really what it's all about. Which also then leads me to something else. So it's not just about how the site is working for you by way of information for which you're receiving. Something else that's worth being aware of is keeping an eye on the notifications. So keeping an eye on the notifications are exactly that. So I can see that a number of you have followed me rather. I can see Joss has responded to a comment I've made and said thank you. So what I'm going to do then is go to that information itself, and I'm going to thank you, just because it's a nice thing to do. But what I've also got coming through is, again, profile viewing. And if I start to scroll a bit further down, I've also got things like, in this case, it's Chris's birthday. Now, does it really matter that it's Christian's birthday? Well, yeah, it does to him, it does to his wife. Admittedly, it's been a while since I've seen Christian. Having said that, he's a nice chap and I've known him for donkey's years. So what I'm going to do is just drop him a little note. Now, rather than doing a happy birthday as a statement, which is fairly generic and boring, what I'm actually going to do is go to GIFs. And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to post him a happy birthday GIF. So there's various ones coming through. Now, he and I have known each other for an awfully long time. So I'm going to do something a bit silly just because I can, because we've known each other that long. You'll find that funny. Now, the thing with a GIF, something to be mindful of, is that when you do send a GIF, as I've just done, it's literally one click and gone. You can't remove it, or you can't bring it back or stop it. So please make sure that if you do use things like GIFs, cool, no problems. Just be conscious that it goes. Alternatively, again, depending on the statements that you'll be receiving. So let me just find somebody else's as an example. So trending content, for example, so this is where they're sharing articles that they think I'm interested in. So this stuff can be useful. So do think about utilizing this stuff. But if the notifications which you're receiving are things you're not interested in, what you then need to do is actually delete or turn off the notification. It stops you then receiving them if they're less interesting to you. It's all about getting the site to work for you, but in order to get it work for you properly, you do need to provide it with information in order to get a good response through it in terms of what's coming in. Okay, couple of minutes left. I'm very conscious that I've been talking an awful lot, but hopefully you guys have all been finding this useful. Something I just want to jump back to quite quickly, and more to do with sort of insights and perspectives and thoughts. So if I just jump back to the deck quickly, a couple other things. I mean, firstly, I'd like to think Ben Franklin said this, but I did find it on the net. So it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation, but only one bad one to lose it. Okay, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying be worried, but what I'm saying is be conscious. And what I mean by that is I use an acronym when it comes to thinking before you post. And what I mean by that is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? So if you're going to post anything, whether it be interacting with somebody's content, whether it be originating and sharing your own, think before you do it. And this holds true not just for LinkedIn, but for any form of social that you're using. Because if you think through it and go, well, how many of this, if you were to score it out of 5, how much of it is it? So if it's 1 out of 5, I'd recommend you don't post it, because it's likely to just be annoying or untrue, unrequired, not necessarily showcasing you in the best light. If it's 2, kind of think about it before you do. If it's 3, then you should be good to post it because you've got enough reasons for posting it. And that also then gives you the opportunity to perhaps defend it if you need to, bearing in mind that when you share stuff online, people may not always agree. 4, absolutely great. 5, absolutely without a doubt. Hands down, do share it. If you think it's going to be true, helpful, inspiring, and kind, it's just a nice way to think about doing stuff. What you also want to do in terms of next steps, I would highly recommend, if you've not done so already, search for yourself online, see what's going on. Always, always, always check your privacy on anything. I'm not just talking about LinkedIn. As I say, think before you post. Deactivate and delete if you no longer use it, but always try and be positive as well. And then in terms of today, you want to make sure you go in and set your basics in terms of your settings and your privacy, start to build that initial profile and start to think about how you build that network and start to build those relationships going forward. Okay. Couple of minutes left. So let's throw it open to any other questions. I've just had one drop in. So I'm going to go back to LinkedIn to show you the answer to this. So there we go. Right. So if I just jump back, the question that came through, when you're viewing somebody's profile, do they always get information that you viewed it, or can you look at them without knowing you viewed? Back to what I said right at the start, slightly jokingly, but yes, you can set your privacy based on what people see, based on your settings. So if for any reason you don't want people to know you're looking at them, all you need to do is go into Me, under Me, go Settings and Privacy. Under Settings and Privacy, you go Visibility. Under Visibility, you change your profile viewing options. So you can make yourself anonymous if you wish to. The only downside in doing so means you don't get to see when people look at you. Unless you subscribe, that is not enough of a reason to subscribe. So think about it perhaps. One other piece, just whilst we're here as well, just get rid of Christian's message. One other piece, just whilst we're here. In relation to that, in terms of who's viewing you, on your homepage, you can always see who's viewing you. So I can see here spikes in activity in terms of what's going on, and I can see who the individuals are, but I can only ever see them if they choose to show me. To put it in context, somebody at Queen's University Belfast looked at me yesterday. No idea who, and I'll never get to know. Likewise, 2 days ago, somebody from Space Zero looked at me. Again, don't know who. I can make an educated guess, but I don't know for definite. So, do go through and think about that in terms of what's coming on. Do you want to know who's checking you out or not? Again, it's entirely up to you. The last piece, though, within this as well, you only get the big detail and the big data if you are a subscriber. As I say, personally, it's not worth paying just to see who's been looking at you. It's not enough of a reason for it. Okay. Couple of minutes left. Well, a couple of minutes to one, rather. Doesn't seem to be any other questions coming through. So I'm just going to hold for a sec. Victoria, anything from you?
No, that's all been brilliant, Lincoln. I've been listening in the background, always taking in your wise words. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining. If you do have any questions for Lincoln, do put them in our Q&A box. We'll be taking a lunch break and coming back at 2. As I said, if you're not registered with the OA already, please do that. And yeah, nothing else from me. I will see you all back at 2. Thank you very much, Lincoln. That's been great.
Cool, nice. For any of you leaving us now, good luck. Hopefully it was useful. For those of you staying around for more punishment, or glutton for punishment rather, no worries. I'll see you in an hour.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lincoln.